This is the Tree of Life, Season 14, Chapter 6. In this episode, we will be interpreting the scale of negation and the flipping of phase of a bodily cycle as the period associated with a particular function. To start off, if we interpret the scale of negation corresponding to a particular impulse as the period of that function, and we interpret the time associated with the flipping of phase associated with a cycle as the period of that function, then we can say that since 1 over the period equals the frequency of each. This leads to a number of consequential observations. Since we see that sublimation elongates the phase associated with a cycle, then we can see that by elongating the phase associated with that cycle, one is decreasing the frequency of the function corresponding to that cycle. We must assume that these functions can possibly interact either within the same structure or an adjacent structure, secondary structure. Finally, we can observe that if all the impulses within a structure have periods and frequencies associated with them, the resulting structure taken as a snapshot, at any given instant, represents, when there is common affirmation to the same impulse for any structure members, an overlapping frequency as between the functions corresponding to those two individuals. Thus, we see that, for example, if person B has a frequency of 2 cycles per second corresponding to impulse 1 and person C has a frequency of 4 cycles per second corresponding to impulse 1, then we know that every second cycle of person C will overlap with person B. This is also interesting because, as we saw in a previous podcast, adjacent structures can comprise the same individuals with one substitution. This means that there may be a link between the affirmational impulse and negational impulse, as between two structures observed at the same time. This means that elongation of the phase associated with a cycle through sublimation, that is, decrease in the frequency, can impact an adjacent structure as well. Finally, we observe that the frequency bands corresponding to a specific bodily cycle may be impacted by an adjacent structure through the elongation of the phase. We must imagine that coincident pressures of in-group formation, or preferential expectation matching, act to restrict individuals to overlapping frequencies, or the reverse. This shows us that by tinkering with the length of phase through sublimation, one can certainly predict shifts within the primary, secondary structure, and so on and so forth. Lastly, if we understand that the scale of negation refers to the period of negation of a particular impulse, then we can see that it also generates the frequency associated with that negation. This may go a long way to explaining why infinite recursion can result from a sufficiently long period, if that reduces the frequency relative to some other members of a structure created by an intersection. The smaller the frequency, the more likely it will overlap with the other individuals, which can impair preferential expectation matching or exclusive frequency bands. That's the end of the podcast for today.